"Sign the papers, Hannah. Your father is barely cold in the ground and you're already drowning." Those words hit harder than the shovel still dirty from digging the grave. Hannah Mercer stood at the edge of everything her family had ever built: a failing ranch, a nearly dry well, and a debt her uncle couldn't wait to collect. Everyone in Clearwater expected her to fold. Everyone assumed a woman alone on the Wyoming frontier had no future worth fighting for. They were wrong, and what happened next would change every single one of them. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel. Follow Hannah's journey all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The funeral was over in 20 minutes. That was the thing nobody warned her about. How fast it all happened. How the preacher said his words and closed his Bible and walked back toward town without looking at her twice. How the men who used to tip their hats to her father now stood at a careful distance, boots shuffling in the dirt, nobody quite willing to meet her eyes. 20 minutes. And just like that, Robert Mercer was in the ground, and Hannah was standing alone beside a cottonwood tree on a hill, overlooking land that was bleeding money from every corner. She didn't cry at the funeral. She'd done her crying the night before, alone in the kitchen, with her father's coffee cup still sitting on the table where he'd left it 3 mornings ago. She'd cried until she couldn't anymore, and then she'd washed her face and made herself a promise. The ranch stays in Mercer hands. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, the ranch stays. She was still standing at the grave when she heard him coming. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She recognized the sound of Gerald Pruitt's boots, heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who'd already decided how a conversation was going to end before it started. Her father's brother. 12 years older than her father had been. 12 years more willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. Hannah. She turned slowly. Gerald was holding a leather satchel, the kind lawyers used. "You want to do this right now," she said. "Today." The bank doesn't grieve Hannah. Neither does debt. He opened the satchel and pulled out a folded set of papers. "I've already spoken to Thomas Hale at First Wyoming Trust. The ranch carries $4,200 in outstanding loans. The cattle numbers are down by half. The well output is—" "I know what the well output is." Her voice stayed flat. "I'm the one hauling the water." Gerald extended the papers toward her. "Sign these. I'll take the property off your hands at fair market value, cover the bank debt, and you'll walk away clean. No shame in it. You're 28 years old. You can start over somewhere easier." Hannah looked at the papers. Then she looked at her father's grave. Then she looked back at Gerald. "Somewhere easier," she repeated quietly. "A town. A proper job. You could teach school. You're educated enough." "My father built this ranch with his hands," Hannah said. "He came out here with $40 and a mule and he built something from nothing. And you want me to sign it away the same afternoon we put him in the ground?" Gerald's expression didn't change. "Your father was a stubborn man who died broke. I'm offering you a way out of repeating his mistake." The words landed like a slap. Hannah took the papers from his hand. For one moment, Gerald smiled. Then she folded them once and handed them back. "Get off my land," she said. His smile disappeared. "Hannah." "I said get off my land, Gerald, and don't come back without an invitation." He stared at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. Calculation. The look of a man adjusting his plans rather than abandoning them. "You'll change your mind," he said. "In 2 months, maybe 3. When the well runs completely dry. When you can't make the loan payment. When the cattle start dying." He tucked the papers back into his satchel. "I'll be patient." He walked back toward the road. Hannah stood at her father's grave until she couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. Then she exhaled. "I'm going to figure this out, Dad," she said quietly to the mound of turned earth. "I don't know how yet, but I will." The cottonwood leaves moved above her in the wind. She took it as an answer. Sing. The first 3 weeks after the funeral nearly broke her. Not emotionally, she didn't have time for that. Physically, the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and makes it hard to close your hands in the morning. The kind that makes you sit down on a hay bale for 1 minute and wake up 40 minutes later with your face against the wood. She was doing everything her father had done, plus everything the two hands he'd let go 6 months ago had done, plus things none of them had ever quite gotten around to. The north fence was down in 2 places. She fixed it herself with wire and a hammer and a vocabulary that would have embarrassed her mother. God rest her soul. The barn's east wall had a split running from roof to foundation. She braced it with timber. She cut herself and dragged across the property on a rope. The breeding mare, a big bay named Duchess, had developed a swelling in her left foreleg that needed warm compresses twice a day, morning and night, which meant adding an extra hour to both ends of a day that was already longer than it should have been. And the well. The well was the problem that kept her awake at night. It was producing maybe a third of what it once had. Not enough for the cattle, not enough for the household. She was hauling supplemental water from Clearwater Creek in barrels twice a week, which took half a day each time and left her arms feeling like they belonged to someone else. Nights she sat at this kitchen table with her father's account book spread out in front of her and a candle burning low, and she tried to find some combination of numbers that added up to survivable. She hadn't found it yet, but she kept looking. The first time the people in town really let her see what they thought it was Mrs. Caldwell at the general store. Hannah had come in for flour salt and a new coil of fence wire. She was still dirty from the morning's work. There was mud on her boots and a fresh cut across her left palm from the wire she'd been handling, and she probably should have cleaned up first. But the day didn't leave much room for vanity. Mrs. Caldwell was behind the counter. 2 other women were shopping Martha Price and someone Hannah didn't recognize. The conversation stopped when she walked in. Hannah. Mrs. Caldwell's smile was the practiced kind. The kind people wore when they felt sorry for you. How are you managing, dear? Fine, thank you. She set her list on the counter. I need these if you have them. Mrs. Caldwell looked at the list. I can put these on your account. I'll pay cash. Hannah set the money on the counter. Mrs. Caldwell's eyebrows moved a fraction. Of course. Hannah waited while the woman gathered the items. Behind her, she could hear the other 2 women not quite talking. The specific silence of people who have something to say and are waiting for the right moment to say it. She almost made it to the door. Hannah! It was Martha Price. You really ought to think about what Gerald is offering. He mentioned it to my husband. He said the terms are quite generous considering. Hannah stopped. She didn't turn around yet. Considering what Martha... A pause. Considering your situation. A woman alone out there, nobody expects you to. I mean, it's a hard enough life for a man with a full crew. You shouldn't have to. I appreciate the concern. Hannah turned now, and she kept her voice pleasant. But Mercer Ranch isn't for sale. Has a nice day. She walked out. She didn't let herself feel it until she was back on the wagon seat with the reins in her hands and Clearwater a quarter mile behind her. Then she felt it. Not hurt. Not exactly. Something closer to a burning in her chest that she recognized as determination at a temperature she hadn't reached before. They expected her to fail. Every single one of them. Fine. Let them expect it. It was late September when the well situation became a genuine crisis. Hannah had been monitoring the output, daily recording it in a small notebook, the way her father had taught her to track rainfall and pasture conditions. The numbers told a story she didn't want to read. The water table was dropping. At the current rate by November, the well would be producing almost nothing. Without a functioning well, she couldn't sustain the herd through winter. Without the herd, there was no ranch. She'd written to 3 men in the county who were known to locate underground water. 2 didn't respond. 1 came out, walked the property for 2 hours, charged her $3 for the visit, and told her the most likely spot for a new well was on the northeastern corner, where the rock shelf ran too deep to dig by hand and required equipment she couldn't afford. That night, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time without opening the account books. She was trying to work out whether there was a version of this that ended with her keeping the ranch. Whether the promise she'd made at her father's grave was one she was actually capable of keeping, or whether it was the kind of promise grief made before reality arrived. She didn't hear the knock at first. It came again, 3 solid raps on the front door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors after dark on a frontier ranch were rarely welcome news. She picked up her father's rifle from beside the door before she opened it. The man on the porch was a stranger, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a range coat that had seen several hard seasons, hat in his hands. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, not old, but settled. Like land that had been through enough weather to stop being surprised by any of it. His expression when he saw the rifle didn't change. "Wyatt Callahan," he said. "I run cattle out of the Callahan spread north of the Clearwater Ridge. Sorry for the hour. I would have come sooner, but I had to see to some business in town first." Hannah kept the rifle where it was. "What kind of business brings you to my door after dark, Mr. Callahan?" "The honest kind." He met her eyes steadily. "I'd like to talk to you about purchasing some of your eastern pasture land, the strip along the creek boundary. I need to expand my cattle routes, and that section would solve a problem I've been working on for 2 years." "It's not for sale." "I figured you'd say that." He didn't look deterred. "Would you be willing to hear an offer before you decide?" Hannah studied him for a moment. He was being direct. She respected direct. "One conversation," she said. "You can come in." She lowered the rifle, but she didn't put it down. He sat at her kitchen table, and he laid out his offer clearly and without embellishment. The eastern strip, roughly 60 acres along the creek, at a price that was, she had to admit, fair. Better than fair if she was being honest. "That land is part of the ranch boundary," she said. "I sell it, I compromise the water access from the creek. I've thought about that." He nodded. "I'd be willing to put a water easement in writing. Your cattle keep full access to the creek regardless of ownership." She hadn't expected that. She looked at him more carefully. "You've done your homework," she said. "I try to." He paused. "I also know what your situation is, Miss Mercer. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because I'd rather deal straight with you than pretend I don't know what's happening." "What do you think is happening?" "I think your well is going dry, and your uncle wants your ranch, and you're one bad winter away from losing everything your father built." He said it without softening it. Not cruel, just honest, the way you'd tell someone their roof was failing. "And I think the land sale might give you enough capital to drill a new well and get through to spring." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "You figured all that out on your own?" "Some of it. People in town talk." He paused. "Your father ran a good operation. I knew him slightly, not well, but enough to respect what he built." She felt something move in her chest at that, unexpected. "He was a good rancher," she said. "One of the best I ever knew. He just ran out of time." "That happens to a lot of good men." She looked at the account books on the table, then at the man sitting across from them. "I'm not going to sell the eastern strip, Mr. Callahan." He nodded slowly. "All right. But I appreciate the offer being made straight." She closed the account books. "Most of the men who've come through that door lately have been trying to take this ranch out from under me. You're the first one to bring something that might actually help." He stood, picking up his hat from the table. "If you change your mind." "I won't." She paused. "But thank you for coming." He nodded once and started for the door. He stopped before he reached it. "The north fence?" he said, not turning around. "I noticed the repair on my way in. The bracing on the second post won't hold through a hard wind. If you drive a second stake 18 inches to the left and angle it 30 degrees... He stopped himself. "Sorry, not my fence." Hannah looked at the back of his hat for a moment. "How do you know it won't hold?" He turned. "Because I made the same repair on my own fence 4 years ago and lost the whole section in a March storm." She was quiet for a moment. 18 inches to the left, she said. "And 30 degrees." She nodded. He put on his hat and walked out. Hannah stood in her kitchen for a long moment after the door closed. Then she picked up her lantern and went out to look at the north fence post. He was right. She drove the second stake by lantern light in the cold dark, angling it exactly 30 degrees. And when she tested the assembly, it was solid in a way the first repair hadn't been. She went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at the account books for a while without seeing them. Something had shifted. She wasn't sure what. Maybe nothing. Maybe the exhaustion was making her see things that weren't there. But for the first time since her father's funeral, the evening hadn't felt quite so empty. She blew out the candle and went to bed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she slept through the night. He came back 2 days later, not with another offer, not to talk. He arrived before 7 in the morning with a wagon loaded with lumber and a teenage boy who was clearly his son. Same square jaw, same unhurried way of moving, though the boy had his mother's eyes, Hannah guessed. Dark and a little watchful. "What is this?" Hannah said from the porch. "The east wall of your barn has a split that'll fail in the first hard freeze," Wyatt said. "My boy Luke and I had a free morning." Hannah stared at him. "I didn't ask for your help." "No, you didn't." He climbed down from the wagon. Luke started unloading the timber. "Mr. Callahan, Miss Mercer." He stopped and looked at her with the same unhurried directness he'd had at her kitchen table. "I'm not doing this because I think you can't manage. I can see you manage just fine. I'm doing it because that wall is going to fail, and it's going to take half your barn with it, and I happen to have the lumber and the time, and a teenage boy who needs to learn that hard work done for a neighbor isn't charity. It's just what people do." The boy. Luke was already lifting boards from the wagon. He glanced at Hannah with a small, careful smile. He looked about 15, 16 maybe. Hannah looked at the barn wall, at the split she'd been bracing and rebracing for 2 weeks, at the repair that was never quite enough. Then she looked at Wyatt Callahan. "I'll make breakfast," she said finally. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like a small acknowledgement that the world had just worked the way it was supposed to. "That'd be appreciated," he said. "Luke hasn't eaten since before sunup and he gets irritable." "I do not," Luke said from behind a stack of lumber. "He does," Wyatt said. Hannah went inside to make breakfast. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Hannah didn't just cook and stand aside. She hauled timber-held boards in place, passed tools when they were needed, and asked enough intelligent questions about the repair method. That after the first hour, Wyatt stopped explaining things at a basic level and started talking to her the way he'd talk to another rancher. Luke noticed. She could tell by the way the boy's attitude shifted from polite but careful to genuinely engaged. He started talking more freely, asked about Duchess's leg injury, showed more interest in the cattle in the south pasture than Hannah expected from a teenager who hadn't come here to examine someone else's herd. "How many head are you running?" Luke asked her, leaning against the repaired barn wall during a late afternoon break. 32, she said. "Down from 60 before my father got sick." "What happened to the others?" "Luke." Wyatt's voice came from across the barn. A single word, a quiet correction. "No, it's all right." Hannah looked at the boy. "We sold half when the medical bills started, and we lost 8 in the cold snap last February. We hadn't been able to fortify the sheltering properly." Luke nodded, thinking about this seriously. "My dad lost 11 head in that same snap. He says this winter's going to be worse." Hannah looked across the barn at Wyatt, who was measuring something along the roofline. "Is he right about the winter?" "He's usually right about weather," Luke said, with the resignation of a son who had learned this the hard way. "And cattle, and fence repairs." A pause. "And most things honestly. It's kind of annoying." Hannah almost smiled. "I heard that," Wyatt said without looking up. "You were supposed to," Luke said perfectly pleasantly. By the time they finished, the barn wall was stronger than it had been when the barn was new. Wyatt wiped his hands on a work rag and looked at the repair with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd done something correctly. "That'll hold," he said. "It will," Hannah agreed. She looked at it for a moment. Then, "Thank you, both of you." Luke gave her a genuine smile, open and uncomplicated, the smile of a boy who hadn't yet learned to guard it. It was a good morning. Wyatt was loading the unused lumber back into the wagon. Hannah watched him for a moment. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. He didn't stop loading. "I told you." "You told me about neighbors and hard work. That's not what I'm asking." He set down the last board and looked at her. The evening light was beginning to soften the edges of everything, and he stood there in it with his hat pushed back, and something in his expression that she couldn't quite name. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Left me with the ranch and a son who was 11 and didn't understand why the world had suddenly gotten so much harder." He paused. "Somebody helped me when I needed it. Didn't ask, just showed up with lumber and time. I never forgot that." Hannah looked at him. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "I'm sorry about your father." A moment passed between them. Simple. Not complicated by anything except the honesty in it. "Tomorrow morning," Wyatt said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "We'll look at your well. I know a man who might have a better solution than drilling." "I didn't ask." "No," he said. "You didn't." He clicked to the horses. Luke, already up on the seat, waved at her with the easy friendliness of someone who'd already decided this was fine. Hannah stood in front of her barn, the barn with its newly sound wall, and watched them go down the road. The evening was quiet. The cattle were settled. The ranch was still hers. And for the first time since Robert Mercer went into the ground, it felt like it might stay that way. She stood there a while longer than she needed to, her hand resting on the barn wall, feeling the solid new timber beneath her palm. Then she went inside. The account books were on the table. This time when she opened them, she found a number combination she hadn't seen before. Not easy, not certain, but possible. She sat with that word for a long time. Possible. Outside, the cottonwood leaves moved against the darkening Wyoming sky, and the ranch was quiet, and Hannah Mercer, who everyone in Clearwater had already written off, already pitied, already counted as finished, bent over her father's ledgers and started building a plan. The man who showed up with lumber and no explanation turned out to be harder to get rid of than Hannah expected. Not in an unwelcome way. That was the part she couldn't quite make sense of. Wyatt Callahan didn't push, didn't announce himself, didn't ask for gratitude, or make her feel like she owed him something she'd have to pay back later. He simply appeared when something needed doing, did it correctly, and left without ceremony. Like a man who understood that the greatest offense you could give a capable woman was to make her feel rescued. She respected that more than she wanted to admit. The well situation was the first real test. 3 mornings after the barn repair, Wyatt arrived before sunup with a man named Clem Dorsey. Wiry, 70 years old, if he was a day, with the kind of face that looked like it had been left out in the weather so long it had turned to leather. Clem was, according to Wyatt, the best water finder in the territory, who didn't charge you $3 just to walk your land and shrug. Hannah looked at Clem. Clem looked at her with small, sharp eyes that didn't miss much. "Your father tried to deepen the existing shaft about 2 years ago," Clem said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know that?" "The timber lining changed color at 30 feet. Fresh cut going deeper. Whoever did it gave up about 8 feet down. Hit hardpan." Hannah stared at him. "You haven't even been to the well yet." "No," Clem agreed. "But I will." He looked at Wyatt. "She's observant." "I know," Wyatt said. Hannah looked between them. "Should I be concerned that you two are discussing my qualities like I'm not standing here?" "No offense intended," Clem said, already walking toward the well. "I'd just like to know what I'm working with." It turned out Clem's solution wasn't drilling a new shaft. It was relining the existing one with a different timber configuration that would allow water to seep in from the surrounding rock table, rather than relying on the primary underground source. It was a technique, he explained, that had been developed by miners working dry mountain shafts and applied to ranch wells with considerable success. "It won't give you the volume you had before," he told her afterward. "But it'll give you enough, and it'll stabilize. Won't keep dropping." Hannah looked at the well and then at Clem. "How much?" He named a figure, half what the drilling estimate had been. She could manage it. "I'll need 2 full days and someone to run the rope mechanism," Clem added. He looked pointedly at Wyatt. "I'll be here," Wyatt said. He hadn't looked at Hannah when he said it. Just stated it as fact, the same way he stated everything. Hannah opened her mouth, closed it. "Fine," she said. Clem smiled for the first time. It rearranged his whole face. "She gives in gracefully," he said to Wyatt. "That's rarer than you'd think." "I heard that," Hannah said. "You were supposed to," Clem said, echoing Luke so precisely that Hannah had to look away to keep from laughing. The well took 2.5 days. During those 2.5 days, Hannah learned things about Wyatt Callahan that he didn't offer and she didn't directly ask for, but that surfaced anyway, the way things do when people work alongside each other in close quarters for long hours. She learned that he'd come to Wyoming from Texas 11 years ago with his wife Eleanor and a modest cattle stake, and built the Callahan spread from raw land, the same way her father had built Mercer Ranch through stubbornness and physical labor, and a refusal to accept what the territory said was impossible. She learned that Eleanor had died of a fever in the winter of '84, and that Wyatt had spent approximately 6 months afterward operating entirely on mechanical habit, feeding cattle, fixing fences, cooking meals for Luke, without any real awareness of what he was doing or why. That it had been Luke, eventually, who pulled him back. Not with words, just by needing him in the specific, persistent way that children need their parents, which doesn't stop because the parent is grieving. She learned that Luke was 16, not 15, as she'd guessed. That the boy had his mother's curiosity and his father's patience, a combination that made him, in Wyatt's words, either very easy or very exhausting, depending on the day. She learned that Wyatt had been watching the situation at Mercer Ranch since before Robert died. Not in a predatory way. In the way a neighboring rancher watches a struggling operation with the awareness that what happens to one property on a frontier affects every property around it. "You came to buy the eastern strip," she said on the second evening when Clem had gone home and the well work was almost done, and she'd brought coffee out, and they were both sitting on opposite sides of an exhausted silence. "That was the real reason you came that first night." "Yes," he said. "But you don't actually need it." A pause. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I could use it." "That's not the same thing." He set the cup down. The evening was cooling fast the way Wyoming evenings did in late September, dropping 20 degrees between sundown and full dark. "No," he said. "It's not." Hannah waited. "I came to see if you were managing," he said finally. The land was a reason to knock on the door. She considered that for a long moment. "You could have just asked how I was managing. Men don't do that well on the frontier," he said. "Showing up with a legitimate business purpose is more acceptable than showing up because you're concerned. People receive it better." "I receive honesty better than politics," Hannah said. "I know that now." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll adjust." The morning Clem declared the well finished and functional. Hannah stood at the edge of the shaft and watched water rise steadily in the bucket and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there since before her father's death. It wasn't fixed. Not all of it. The debt was still real, the cattle numbers still low, the winter ahead still formidable. But the well, this specific critical life or death problem was solved. She turned to find both men watching her. "Well," Clem said. "That's a very intentional choice of words," Hannah said. He laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Wyatt said you'd catch that." She looked at Wyatt. He shrugged with the complete innocence of someone who had absolutely predicted the outcome. She paid Clem what she owed him, shook his hand, and watched him leave. Then she turned to Wyatt. "I don't know how to do this," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Do what?" "Accept help without feeling like I'm admitting I can't manage." He was quiet for a moment, not filling the space with easy reassurance, just letting the question sit there, which she respected. "My neighbor Tom Breckett helped me rebuild my cattle shed the winter after Eleanor died," he said. "Came over with his sons, and they worked 2 days and didn't ask for anything. I had a hard time with it. Felt like I was announcing to everyone that I was falling apart." "Were you?" "A little bit," he said honestly. "But the shed still needed building, and I couldn't do it alone. Those two things were both true at the same time." He looked at her. "Help isn't a confession of weakness, Hannah. It's just practical." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed. She thought he noticed that she noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. "Practical," she repeated. "On a frontier ranch in Wyoming, practical is about the most important thing a person can be." October arrived and brought Luke with it. The boy had taken a genuine interest in Mercer Ranch that went beyond his father's involvement. He appeared 2 or 3 mornings a week before school let out for the season. The Clearwater schoolhouse closed for the winter in late October, and spent whatever time he had working with a focused diligence that reminded Hannah uncomfortably and warmly in equal measure of herself at that age. He was especially attached to Duchess. The mare's leg had been improving steadily but slowly, and Luke had appointed himself her primary caretaker, with an authority that Hannah hadn't granted and the mare hadn't objected to. He talked to the horse constantly, a steady, low-voiced commentary on everything from the weather to the state of the South Fence to his opinions on a book he'd been reading, which appeared to be about naval battles and was entirely irrelevant to a pregnant horse in Wyoming. But Duchess seemed unbothered by the subject matter. "She's responding to the voice more than the topic," Hannah told him one morning, watching him work the warm compress on the foreleg. "I know," Luke said. "Same principle as cattle. Consistent sound builds trust. Dad taught me that." He paused. "He says most things that need looking after cattle horses land, they don't want perfection. They just want consistency." Hannah looked at him. "Your father says that all the time." Luke glanced up at her. "I think he's also talking about people when he says it. He just uses animals as the example because it's less awkward." Hannah stood there for a moment. A 16-year-old boy had just said the most perceptive thing anyone had said to her in months. "You're very observant," she said. "Dad says that too." He went back to the compress. "He says it like it might be a problem someday." "It won't be," Hannah said. "It's a gift." Luke smiled without looking up. A private, pleased smile that he was clearly trying to contain. The first real trouble came on a Wednesday morning in late October, and it came in the form of a man named Douglas Pell. Pell was a land speculator, which was the polite word for what he did, who had arrived in Clearwater County 3 years ago and had since acquired through various legal and semi-legal maneuvers 4 properties that their original owners had genuinely not intended to sell. He was a well-dressed man, articulate. He had a lawyer with him at all times. The way other men had pocket watches, it gave him a sense of always having the right answer for any occasion. He rode onto Mercer Ranch without an invitation and found Hannah in the south pasture moving cattle. "Miss Mercer." He pulled up his horse with the practiced ease of a man who was comfortable wherever he placed himself. "Douglas Pell. I don't think we've been formally introduced." "I know who you are," Hannah said. She didn't stop moving cattle. "Then you know I'm a man who makes fair offers and follows through on them. I know you're a man who bought the Kettner homestead for 1/3 of its value after convincing the bank to accelerate their loan," Hannah said. "I wouldn't call that fair." Pell's expression adjusted smoothly. The Kettner situation was complicated. Most situations look complicated when someone's working to make them that way. She finally stopped and looked at him directly. "What do you want, Mr. Pell?" The same thing I suspect several people have already approached you about. He smiled, the kind of smile that was designed to convey trustworthiness. Mercer Ranch. I'm prepared to offer considerably above what your uncle has proposed. My uncle and I have already resolved our conversation. I heard. He nodded. I'm not your uncle, Miss Mercer. I don't want to pressure you. I want to make a business transaction that benefits both of us. The ranch isn't for sale. It will be, he said pleasantly. That well of yours was on its last legs. The winter coming is going to be the worst in a decade by all accounts. Your debt load is... How do you know about my debt load? He paused, just for a fraction of a second, but she caught it. It's a small county, he said. Hannah looked at him with new eyes. The debt information was not public. The bank didn't share it. Gerald knew it, but Gerald wouldn't share it with a competitor for the property. Unless Gerald and Pell weren't competing. Unless they were coordinating. Get off my land, Hannah said. Her voice was entirely level. And don't come back. Pell looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant mask stayed in place, but something behind it shifted a kind of patient menace, the look of a man who had dealt with resistance before and understood it as temporary. I'll be in Clearwater through the spring, he said. My offer stands. He turned his horse and rode out. Hannah stood in the south pasture with cattle moving around her and her heart going hard and fast in her chest. Gerald and Pell. Together. She needed to know how deep that went. She told Wyatt that evening. He was quiet for longer than usual after she finished. Pell knows your debt numbers, he said. Yes. That information came from somewhere. Gerald is the only person outside the bank who has those figures. Wyatt looked at the table. His jaw had tightened in the way she'd noticed it did when he was working through something he didn't like the shape of. Your uncle and Pell together is a different situation than either of them alone, he said. Separately, you can manage them. Together, they have the money and the legal reach to make real trouble. I know. What do you want to do? She looked at him across the table. He'd asked her that, what do you want to do? Not what should we do, not what do you think you should do. He had a habit of asking her opinion first before offering his own, and she had come to realize it wasn't strategic. It was just how he thought. I need to understand exactly what Gerald owns and what agreements he might have made, she said. My father kept records, ledgers going back 15 years. Gerald wouldn't know about all of them. Dad kept the older ones in the cellar. Have you looked through them? Not completely. There's been a lot of other things. Then that's where we start, Wyatt said. It might take days. There are dozens of books. Then it takes days. She looked at him steadily. Wyatt, you have your own ranch. Luke can handle the morning work. He's capable. He met her eyes. And some things are more important than morning work. They spent 3 evenings in the cellar with lanterns and her father's ledgers. It was close, dusty, honest work. Hannah read through the books while Wyatt helped organize them chronologically. His handwriting in the margin notes she was making was neater than she expected, the tight, careful script of a man who'd had to keep his own accounts for years. On the second evening, Luke appeared at the top of the cellar stairs with a pot of coffee and 2 cups, and the expression of a young man who understood more about what was happening than any of the adults had directly told him. I thought you might need this, he said. Thank you, Luke, Hannah said. He lingered. Miss Mercer, is someone trying to take the ranch? She considered lying. He was 16. But he had those watchful dark eyes that noticed everything, and lying to someone observant was always more insulting than the truth. Some people are trying, she said. We're working on making sure they don't succeed. He nodded, slowly, like he was filing it somewhere serious. Okay, he said. And then with the directness that apparently ran in his family. Good, this ranch should stay yours. It's a good place. He went back upstairs. Hannah looked at the ledger in her hands and felt something move through her. Not grief, not quite. Something closer to gratitude, which was a feeling she'd been keeping at careful arm's length for weeks. because it felt too close to needing people, and needing people on the frontier felt too close to being vulnerable, and vulnerable felt too close to what everyone already assumed she was. She let herself feel it anyway. "He's a good boy," she said quietly. "He is," Wyatt said. His voice was rougher than usual on those two words, like the feeling was too big to come out smooth. On the third evening, Hannah found it. A ledger from 1879, 9 years ago. Inside it, in her father's careful handwriting, was a record of a loan, not from the bank, but a private arrangement between Robert Mercer and Gerald Pruitt. Gerald had lent Robert money in the early years when the ranch was being built. The loan had been repaid. Fully. Every cent documented with dates and amounts, the final payment signed by both men in 1882. But there was more. On the same pages her father had recorded in the detailed, almost compulsive way, he kept all his records notations about irregularities in a water rights agreement that Gerald had brokered for the county in 1881. Payments that didn't match. Land boundary agreements that redirected county water access in ways that benefited Gerald's property significantly. It wasn't the debt records she'd been looking for. It was something much bigger. She sat back on her heels and looked at the ledger for a long moment. "Wyatt." He came and looked over her shoulder. "Read what she was pointing at. Read it again." "Your father documented this," he said. "Not a question. Just the quiet recognition of what it meant." "He documented everything," Hannah said. "He always said that numbers didn't lie if you wrote them down honestly." She closed the ledger carefully. "Gerald has been orchestrating this for years. He wanted this ranch not because it's worth the most money. He wanted it because Dad knew about the water rights fraud, and as long as Mercer Ranch stood and these ledgers existed—" "The documentation existed," Wyatt finished. "Yes." They looked at each other in the lantern light in the cellar of her father's house. "We need to be careful with this," Wyatt said. "Very careful. The moment Gerald knows you found these, he'll move faster," Hannah said. "Yes." She held the ledger against her chest. Outside the wind was picking up, the kind of wind that came before serious weather. The kind her father used to stand on the porch and read like a newspaper, turning his face into it and telling her things she hadn't understood then, but understood now. "The winter is coming early," she said. "I know. Everything is about to get harder." "Probably." She looked at him. In the lantern light, his face was all steady planes and shadows, and she recognized in his expression what she sometimes saw in her own when she caught herself in the reflection of the kitchen window. The particular look of someone who had already lost something irreplaceable and had decided despite that to keep going. "I'm glad you showed up at my door," she said. It came out more direct than she intended. She didn't take it back. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. Simple. True. No performance around it. Hannah stood up and tucked the ledger safely under her arm. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The ranch demanded it, and the threat demanded it, and winter was arriving on the heels of everything else. But she climbed the cellar stairs a different person than the one who had gone down them 3 evenings ago. Not stronger exactly. Something more specific than that. Less alone. Outside, the wind carried the first real bite of cold, and Mercer Ranch stood against it, the way it always had, not perfect, not certain, but standing. Still standing. The wind started 3 days before the storm arrived. Hannah knew that wind. Her father had taught her to read it not by how hard it blew, but by what it carried. This one carried cold, from somewhere deep in the mountains. The kind that didn't apologize for itself, that came down through the passes, with the serious intention of reminding everyone in the territory exactly how small they were against the land they'd chosen to inhabit. She spent those 3 days preparing with the focused urgency of someone who had learned finally to trust her own instincts. Extra feed moved into the barn. The cattle brought to the lower pasture where the natural terrain offered more shelter. The water barrels filled and covered. Every loose piece of equipment secured or stored. She moved fast and she moved smart, and when Wyatt rode over on the second day to help with the cattle repositioning, She already had 2/3 of the herd settled. He looked at what she'd done and said simply, "Good." That one word from him meant more than a paragraph of praise from anyone else in Clearwater County. "Duchess worries me," Hannah told him as they worked the last of the cattle south. "The leg has been improving, but she's not fully sound yet. If she gets spooked by the storm and tries to run—" "Luke reinforced her stall yesterday," Wyatt said. "He added a second tie and packed the floor with extra straw. She won't get loose." Hannah looked at him. He did that without being asked. He did it because he was thinking ahead. There was quiet pride in it, the kind a father tried not to show too much of. "He's been checking on her every morning since you mentioned the leg." "You have a remarkable son," Hannah said. "I know." He said it simply, without false modesty, and she liked that about him, his complete absence of performance. "He's also been asking me questions." "About what?" Wyatt glanced at her sideways. "About you. About the ranch. About whether things are going to be all right." Hannah absorbed that. A 16-year-old boy who had lost his mother was quietly worrying about whether a woman he'd known for 6 weeks was going to be okay. The thought hit her somewhere unguarded. "What do you tell him?" she asked. "That I don't know yet," Wyatt said, "but that we're working on it." She nodded. She appreciated that he hadn't lied to the boy with easy reassurance. "And the ledgers?" she asked. "Have you thought more about what to do with them? Every day." His expression shifted, that jaw tightening that she now recognized as him, working through something he disliked the shape of. "I think we need to talk to someone before the storm hits. Someone with legal knowledge. If Gerald makes a move while we're dealing with weather—" "He will," Hannah said. She'd been thinking the same thing. "That's exactly when he'll move, when I'm most stretched. Then we need the ledgers in safe hands before the storm breaks." "Arthur Crane," Hannah said. Arthur Crane was the nearest thing Clearwater had to a legitimate attorney, older, cautious, but scrupulously honest in a way that was genuinely rare. "He was my father's friend. He won't take Gerald's side." "Can you get to him today?" "This afternoon." She made the decision without hesitation. "Can you stay with the cattle until I'm back?" "That's why I rode over," Wyatt said. Arthur Crane's office above the hardware store was exactly as Hannah remembered from childhood. Small, overheated by an iron stove, and so full of stacked papers that navigating it required a practiced kind of faith that nothing would fall. Crane himself was 71 slight, with white hair and reading glasses perpetually balanced on the end of his nose, and he looked at Hannah across his desk with the attentive seriousness of a man who had known her since she was learning to walk. She put the 1879 ledger on his desk. She explained what she'd found. He read. He didn't rush it. He went back and reread 2 pages she'd flagged. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Robert kept this," he said finally. "All these years. He documented everything. He always said, 'Numbers don't lie if you write them down honestly.'" Crane smiled briefly sadly. "He said that to me more than once." He looked at the ledger again. "Hannah, this is significant. The water rights irregularities alone, if these figures are accurate, and knowing your father's records, I have no doubt they are. Gerald has been siphoning county water access to benefit his own properties for nearly a decade. That's not a civil matter. That's fraud." "I know. And the timing of his interest in your ranch? He needs these records to disappear," Hannah said. "As long as I own Mercer Ranch and these ledgers are in that cellar, his entire arrangement is one audit away from collapse." Crane set down his glasses carefully. "If Gerald knows you've found these—" "He doesn't. Not yet. Then we need to move before he finds out." He looked at the ledger with the expression of a man reorganizing his understanding of a situation he thought he'd already understood. "I'll make certified copies and file them with the county recorder's office in my name. Original documentation on county fraud requires official acknowledgement. That puts it on public record in a way that Gerald cannot simply make disappear." He looked at her. "This will make him angry, Hannah. Very angry and very motivated. "He's already motivated," she said. "I'd rather he be angry at something he can't undo." Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the gravity of a man agreeing to something that mattered. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. "He worried, in those last months, that he was leaving you with too much." She felt it in her throat. "He left me with exactly what I needed," she said. "I just had to find it." She left the ledger with Crane and rode back to the ranch. The wind was stronger by the time she got home. The storm was coming faster than anyone had predicted. It hit that night. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the sudden concentrated fury of a mountain storm that had been building pressure for days and released all of it at once. The wind came first, not the testing kind, but the full violent thing, slamming the barn walls, screaming through every gap in the house structure, sending things flying across the yard that Hannah had been certain were secured. She was awake the moment it started. She was dressed and out the door within 2 minutes. The cattle were the first priority. 3 had broken from the lower pasture shelter when the first wind gust hit the fence. She could hear them disoriented, moving wrong, their sounds cutting through the storm noise with a pitch that meant panic, not just movement. She got 2 of them back. The third ran. She tracked it by sound for 20 minutes across ground that was rapidly becoming dangerous. The temperature dropping, fast ice forming on the grass, the wind pushing at her hard enough that twice she had to stop and brace against it just to stay upright. She got the third animal back to shelter. She was checking the barn Duchess first, then the rest, when Luke appeared out of the dark and the howling wind like a completely unexpected apparition. "Luke!" She grabbed his arm by reflex. "What are you doing here?" "Dad sent me ahead," he said breathlessly. "He's coming with rope and the heavy lanterns. We saw your barn light and knew you were out." He was already moving past her to Duchess's stall, checking the ties he'd reinforced 2 days ago. "She's good," he reported immediately. "Ties holding." Hannah exhaled. "The cattle?" 3 got loose. I got them back. All 3. All 3. Luke looked at her with those serious dark eyes. "By yourself?" "It's my ranch," she said. He absorbed that without argument. Instead, "There are 2 more fence sections down on the north side. Dad's going to need help with the posts. Do you have the extra stakes?" She did. She'd moved them into the barn exactly for this kind of situation. Wyatt arrived 12 minutes later. He came through the barn door with rope over one shoulder and 2 lanterns and the focused expression of a man who had been through enough emergencies to know that panic cost more time than it saved. He looked at Hannah. "Cattle. Secured. Duchess. Fine." Luke reinforced the tie. He looked at his son. Something passed between them, fast, wordless. Pride and relief, and the acknowledgement of a job done correctly. "North fence," Wyatt said. "I know," Hannah said. "I have the stakes." They went out into the storm. Working in that wind, in that cold in the dark, held back only by 2 lanterns and stubbornness. Hannah would remember it later as one of the most purely focused hours of her life. There was no room for anything except the problem directly in front of her hands. Post position, stake angle, rope tension. Wyatt's voice close in the dark, giving her the other measurements, Luke on the far side of each section, holding the line while they drove the stakes. They didn't talk except about the work. They didn't need to. There was a rhythm to it that felt, even in the violence of the storm, almost like something earned. The kind of synchronization that doesn't exist between strangers and doesn't exist between people who are merely being polite to each other. It existed between people who had spent enough time working alongside each other to stop performing and start simply functioning. 3 sections of fence. 1 hour and 20 minutes. All of it holding. They came back to the barn and stood inside the relative shelter of it, and all 3 of them were breathing hard and frozen to varying degrees. Luke had lost feeling in his left hand and was squeezing it mechanically, opening and closing, trying to bring it back. Wyatt had a cut across his jaw from a piece of wire that had snapped in the wind. He hadn't mentioned it, and Hannah only noticed when the lantern light caught the dark line of it. "You're cut," she said. He touched his jaw like he was discovering this information. That's not a sufficient response to a laceration. It's not deep. I'll be the judge of that. She was already moving for the barn supply kit. Her father had kept one mounted near the door gauze carbolic, a needle and thread for the worst cases. She came back and Wyatt stood still while she examined it with the patient tolerance of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that injuries were part of the work. "You're right," she said after a moment. "It's not deep." She cleaned it with carbolic and pressed gauze against it. "Hold this." He held it. Luke was watching them from across the barn with an expression of such careful neutrality that it was itself a kind of statement. "How's the hand?" Hannah asked him without looking away from Wyatt's jaw. "Coming back," Luke said. A pause. "The fence work was good. It was—" Wyatt said, his voice slightly muffled by the gauze. "You held the line on that third section when the wind hit. That mattered." Luke said nothing, but his jaw shifted in the same way his father's did when something landed somewhere important. The storm peaked around 3 in the morning and began pulling back by 5. By the time the first gray light came, the violence had reduced to a hard, steady wind and blowing snow and a cold that felt personal, the kind that wanted you to know it was there. Hannah sent Luke inside to warm up and sleep. He went without argument, which told her how tired he actually was. She and Wyatt did one more check of the cattle, the barn, the fence lines. Walking the perimeter in the gray early light, assessing damage, noting what needed repair, moving in the efficient overlapping way they'd developed over weeks. When they came back to the east side of the property, Wyatt stopped. Hannah stopped too. She followed his gaze. Duchess was gone. The stall door was open. The reinforced ties both of them had held, but the wood panel of the stall wall itself had given way under some impact. A kick, maybe. The mare panicking at the peak of the storm and kicking out hard enough to split a wall that should have held. "She went through the wall," Wyatt said. Hannah was already reading the tracks in the snow. They led east, away from the shelter, away from the pasture, toward the foothills. Her stomach dropped. Duchess was the ranch's breeding future, the only real financial asset with genuine growth potential. Without her, the herd wouldn't expand, the finances wouldn't recover, and every plan Hannah had built in the cellar over ledger books in lantern light was a plan built on a foundation that no longer existed. "How far would she run?" Wyatt asked. "In a storm far. She'd run until something stopped her, or until she found shelter." Hannah looked at the tracks. The snow was already beginning to soften them. "The foothills have a natural rock break about 4 miles east. She might have headed for it instinctively. She's been to that pasture before." 4 miles in current conditions. "I know." She was already moving back to the barn for her horse. "Hannah." His voice was sharp enough to make her stop. "The temperature is still dropping and the trail goes through exposed ridge country. You go alone and you get in trouble. There's nobody to—" "She's my horse, Wyatt." "I know she is. I'm coming with you." She stopped and looked at him. His face was exhausted, cut cold and completely determined. "You've been up all night," she said. "So have you." She looked at him for another moment. Then she went and saddled her horse. He went and saddled his. 4 miles through post-storm foothills terrain was not 4 miles on an open road. They moved as fast as they dared, fast enough to cover ground, careful enough not to lose a horse to a hidden drop or an ice-covered rock. Hannah was tracking, reading the signs the mare had left in snow, and disturbed ground, calling corrections to their route when the trail shifted. Wyatt stayed close and stayed quiet, reading her signals and adjusting without discussion. He trusted her tracking. She registered that and appreciated it without time to say so. 2 miles in, they hit the exposed ridge section, the stretch where the terrain opened up, and the wind came at you from every direction with nothing to break it. Both horses fought it. Hannah's gelding wanted to turn his back to the wind instinctively, and she held him forward through main strength and stubbornness, talking to him the whole time, the way Luke talked to Duchess, low and constant sound over sense. "She came through here." Hannah called to Wyatt over the wind. "The tracks go right." She found the lee side of the ridge. "That's smart for a panicking horse." "She's a smart mare. That's why she matters." She found the tracks again on the far side of the ridge, more settled now, the stride length changing, the panic gait smoothing out. Duchess had calmed once she found shelter from the wind. She was moving more deliberately. "She's not running anymore," Hannah said. "She's looking for something. Food, warmth. The rock break ahead. She knows it." They pushed on. The rock break was exactly where Hannah had said it was. A natural formation where the terrain rose and folded, creating a pocket of relative shelter that held off the worst of the wind. Her father had pastured cattle here in bad weather. Duchess was there, standing in the deepest part of the shelter, head down, sides heaving, one foreleg slightly cocked, the injured leg. She'd worked it hard in the run, and it had cost her. Hannah was off her horse before it fully stopped. "Easy," she said, moving toward the mare slowly. "Easy, girl. I've got you." Duchess lifted her head. Her ears went forward. She recognized Hannah's voice, the way animals recognize the people who have been consistent with them, not with excitement, but with something older and more fundamental. Trust. Hannah reached her and put a hand on her neck and felt the horse shudder once, the whole body releasing something. "Found you," Hannah said. Her voice was steady, but her hand on the mare's neck was shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. She heard Wyatt arrive behind her, heard him reading the situation, assessing the leg, checking the mare's overall condition with the quiet competence of an experienced cattleman. "The leg?" she asked without turning around. "She's worked it, but I don't think she's done serious damage. She needs to be walked back slowly and kept warm." A pause. "She'll be all right, Hannah." Hannah stood with her forehead pressed against the mare's neck. She'd promised her father she would keep this ranch. She'd meant every word of it. But standing here in the rock break with the wind screaming outside, and a mare that represented her entire financial future, shuddering with exhaustion under her hands, she understood something that the ledger books and the fence repairs and the well work hadn't quite taught her. She could fight for this ranch with everything she had. She could plan and document and prepare and push herself past every reasonable limit. And the frontier would still throw things at her that she hadn't planned for. The question was never whether the hard things would come. The question was whether she'd be alone when they did. She heard Wyatt moving beside her, getting the rope ready to lead Duchess, and she straightened up and turned around. The wind had dropped his hat, and he hadn't noticed, and his hair was blown sideways, and his coat was crusted at the collar with ice, and he had one hand on the mare's halter and was watching Hannah with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not concern, not assessment. Something quieter than both of those. Something she didn't have a word for, standing in a Wyoming rock break in the middle of a storm, and wasn't sure she was ready to name. "We should start back," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't look away for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he clicked to Duchess, and they began the long walk back. They were halfway home when the trail gave way. It happened without warning, a shelf of compacted snow overhanging a gully, invisible under the uniform white of the post-storm terrain. Hannah's gelding felt it before she did, lurched sideways trying to correct, and then his back legs went over the edge, and Hannah was thrown not far, not into the gully itself, but hard sideways into the frozen ground, her shoulder taking the impact, and then her head catching a rock that was hidden under 3 inches of snow. She didn't lose consciousness. But for a long moment, the world was just white and wringing her body, trying to decide how badly hurt it was. She heard Wyatt's voice. Close. Right there. "Hannah, look at me." She looked at him. His face was in front of hers, hands on her face, and she could see him clearly. Which was good, she understood, because it meant her eyes were working correctly. "I'm all right," she said, or tried to say. It came out less convincing than she intended. "You hit your head." "I know, I was there." She tried to sit up. His hands steadied her, but didn't stop her. He knew her well enough by now to know that stopping her was counterproductive. She sat up. The world tilted once and then settled. Your horse, she said immediately. He's fine. He caught the edge of the shelf, but he pulled himself back. He's tied. Wyatt's hands were still on her shoulders, steady as posts. Can you tell me how many fingers? She looked. 3. And I have a slight concussion possibly, and we are 4 miles from shelter in dropping temperatures, and we need to move, so can we please have this conversation somewhere warmer? He looked at her for a moment. 3 fingers is correct, he said. I know. And you're right that we need to move. He didn't let go of her arms as she stood. But we're not making 4 miles before the temperature hits dangerous. She understood what he meant immediately. The sky had gone the color that meant rapid temperature fall, that specific gray-white that her father had taught her to fear more than clouds. The Haverford Trapper Cabin, she said. There's one. 2 miles east, maybe 1.5 miles. My father sheltered there twice. Can you ride? She tested her shoulder. Pain, not structural, muscle and probably bruising. Yes. Duchess can't be ridden with that leg. I'll lead her. I know. She was already moving toward her gelding, breathing through the shoulder pain, thinking about the route to the Haverford cabin, doing the calculation of distance versus temperature fall. It was going to be close. Wyatt! She stopped before she mounted. If it gets too close, you leave me at the cabin and take Duchess back. She has to make it. He looked at her with an expression that was for the first time since she'd known him completely unguarded. I'm not leaving you anywhere, he said, not angry, not dramatic, just entirely quietly certain. She looked at him for one moment. Then she mounted, and they rode. Hayton, they made the cabin. Just. The temperature dropped the last half-mile in a way that felt punitive. The cold becoming less weather, and more something with intent, something that wanted a specific outcome. Hannah focused on the riding on the route, on not letting herself register how much her head hurt, or how her hands had gone past cold, into that dangerous numb place. The cabin was small, old, the kind of frontier structure built for utility and nothing else. But it was intact. The door opened. There was an iron stove and a small cache of wood left by whoever had been there last, a trapper's courtesy, the frontier tradition of leaving something for the next person in trouble. Wyatt got Duchess settled outside in the shelter of the cabin's lee wall, the best he could do, and came inside and got the stove going with the efficiency of a man who had started fires in bad situations before. Hannah sat on the cabin's single wooden bench and held her hands near the growing warmth and tried to take inventory of her body with clinical detachment. Shoulder bruised, not broken. She could move the arm fully. Head, the ringing had faded to a dull, specific ache. No double vision. No nausea. Mild concussion at worst. Hands feeling was coming back in all fingers. Painful, but present. No frostbite. She was going to be all right. Wyatt came and sat near her once the stove was going properly. Not beside her, exactly across the small space, close enough that the warmth reached both of them. They were quiet for a while. Outside the wind. She'll make it back all right, Wyatt said, meaning Duchess. The leg got worked, but she's sound underneath it. A week's rest and she'll recover. I know, Hannah said. She paused. Thank you for coming after me today. You'd have found her yourself. Maybe, but I would have been alone when I fell. He looked at the stove. I've been alone with hard things, he said quietly. After Eleanor, running the ranch by myself those first 2 years. Not asking for help, because asking felt like... He paused. Like I was saying the thing I'd built wasn't enough. Like I was saying I wasn't enough. Hannah understood that perfectly. She understood it in a way that went all the way to the bone. And then someone showed up with lumber, she said. He looked at her. And then someone showed up with lumber. A pause. The help didn't make me less. It just made the load carryable. Hannah looked at her hands. The feeling was back in all of them now. The stove was working, and the cabin was warming, and outside, the storm was losing its force, pulling back toward the mountains. I'm glad you came back after the first night, she said. With the lumber. I'm glad you didn't take my no as the final answer. You weren't saying no to the help, he said. You were saying no to looking weak. Those are different things. She looked at him across the small, warm space. There were things present in that cabin that hadn't been named yet. Things that had been building since the night he showed up at her door with his hat in his hands and told her about a fence post without being asked. She was aware of them, the way you're aware of a change in weather, not sudden, not dramatic, just a shift in the quality of the air that means the season is turning. She wasn't ready to name them yet, but she wasn't afraid of them either. And that, for a woman who had spent the better part of a year being afraid of needing anything, felt like the most significant thing that had happened all day. We should try to sleep, she said. Few hours until it's light enough to travel safely. You especially, he said. Head injury. I'll wake you if my vision doubles. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. It's the most reassurance I have available at the moment. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but near enough. Sleep, he said. I'll keep the fire. Hannah closed her eyes. Outside, the storm moved on, and inside a small trapper's cabin on a Wyoming hillside with a fire burning steady, and a man sitting across from her keeping watch. Hannah Mercer slept without once dreaming of losing anything at all. She came home to a changed town. Hannah felt it before she could name it. The morning she rode back into Clearwater to pick up supplies 3 days after the storm, moving carefully because her shoulders still ached and Duchess was still resting. Something was different in the way people looked at her, or more precisely, in the way they didn't. Eyes that found reasons to be elsewhere. Conversations that paused a half-beat too long before resuming. Mrs. Caldwell behind the counter with that particular careful smile that meant she knew something she wasn't going to say directly. It was the smile of a town that had already made up its mind about something. Hannah bought her supplies and said nothing and rode home and sat at the kitchen table and thought. Gerald had moved. She didn't know the shape of it yet, but she could feel the edges of it the way you feel a storm coming through a changed quality of air pressure, dropping something, reorganizing itself in the distance. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The letter from First Wyoming Trust arrived the following morning. She read it once, standing at the door where the delivery rider had handed it to her. Then she sat down on the porch steps and read it again more slowly, making sure she understood every word of what Thomas Hale, the bank's senior officer, was telling her. The bank had received documentation suggesting that the financial records supporting her loan repayment history contained irregularities. A formal review had been initiated. Pending the outcome, the bank was placing Mercer Ranch's loan account under special scrutiny. She would need to appear at the bank within 10 days to present her full account records. And at the bottom, in language that was careful and legal and designed to sound neutral, if the review found evidence of financial mismanagement, the bank reserved the right to accelerate the outstanding loan balance. $4,200, due in full, in 30 days. Hannah sat on those steps for a long time without moving. She had maybe $1,200 accessible. The cattle sold at current prices and in current condition might bring another $800. The land, she would not sell the land. That had never been an option and wasn't one now. $1,200 against $4,200, and 30 days. She folded the letter. She stood up. She went inside and put on her coat and rode to Wyatt's. Route. He read the letter at his kitchen table, with the same careful attention he gave everything. Luke was doing schoolwork in the next room. The Clearwater schoolhouse had reopened after the storm, and the only sound was the scratch of the boy's pencil and the stove working, and Wyatt's complete stillness as he read. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Forged debt records, he said finally. That's what they're claiming I have. That my records showing loan payments are falsified. Her voice was steady. She'd had the ride over to get it steady. Someone provided the bank with documentation suggesting my father's payment records were manufactured. Gerald has access to county records going back years. He could construct something convincing. Yes. And Pell has the legal resources to make it look legitimate. Yes. Wyatt's jaw was doing the thing. He picked up the letter and read one section again. "False witnesses," he said. "It says documentation and witnesses. They've already found people willing to testify." "In a small county," Hannah said, "when a man like Gerald Pruitt and a man like Douglas Pell tell someone that testifying is in their interest, people comply, not because they're dishonest, because they're scared of what happens if they don't." Wyatt set the letter down. "Arthur Crane has the ledger," he said. "Yes, filed with the county recorder, but a fraud claim against me filed with the bank doesn't automatically get countered by a fraud claim I've filed against Gerald. The bank wants to protect the bank. Thomas Hale is not Gerald's friend, but he's not my champion either. He's going to do what the documentation in front of him tells him to do. Unless we get better documentation in front of him first. We have 10 days. Wyatt looked at her. "What do you need?" And there it was again. Not what should you do, not have you considered. What do you need? She'd stopped being surprised by it. She'd started relying on it in a way that no longer unsettled her. "I need to know who testified against me," she said. "I need names. And I need to understand what they were told and what they were shown. I can find that out." "Wyatt, I have relationships in this county that you don't." He said it without apology or condescension. Just fact. Men who won't talk to a woman facing a bank claim because they don't want to get involved. Men who will talk to another rancher over a fence or at the feed store because it's just conversation. He paused. "Let me do this part." She wanted to argue. The reflex was still there. The one that said accepting help was the same as admitting you couldn't manage. But she knew the difference now between pride and strategy, and this was a moment for strategy. "All right," she said. He nodded. Got up from the table. "Stay for supper," he said. "Luke should know what's happening. He'll want to know." "You don't have to. He's been hauling water for your cattle twice a week while Duchess rests," Wyatt said from across the room. "He has a stake in this." Hannah closed her mouth, stayed for supper. Luke took the news with a stillness that was so much older than 16 that it briefly stopped the conversation. He sat at the table and listened to everything Wyatt told him cleanly, plainly, without softening it. And when Wyatt finished, Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are they afraid of?" Hannah looked at him. "Mr. Pruitt and Mr. Pell," Luke said. "What specifically are they afraid of because this?" He gestured at the letter on the table. "This isn't about money. Men with money don't need to forge documents to get more money. They're afraid of something." Wyatt looked at his son. "The ledger," Hannah said quietly. "The water rights documentation my father kept. If that goes to a proper investigation, then they're not just losing the chance to buy your ranch," Luke said. "They're facing fraud charges." "Yes," Luke processed this. "So they're not trying to get the ranch. They're trying to discredit you before you can discredit them." He paused. "They know you found the ledger." The words landed on the table like something dropped from a height. Hannah went cold, not from surprise. From the recognition of something she hadn't fully assembled until a 16-year-old boy said it plainly. "They know," she said slowly. "How would they know?" Wyatt asked, but his voice had already shifted, already working the problem. "Arthur Crane filed the ledger with the county recorder," Hannah said. "That filing is public record. The moment it was filed..." She stopped. "Gerald has someone watching the county recorder's office, or someone in it. So we saw the filing," Wyatt said, "and he moved immediately. The letter from the bank arrived 4 days after I gave Crane the ledger." She looked at the letter on the table. 4 days. Gerald had this in motion within 4 days. "Then he's been planning the countermove for a while," Wyatt said. "He had it ready. He was just waiting to see if you'd found the documentation." The kitchen was very quiet. "He baited me," Hannah said. The realization was cold and clarifying. Gerald had pushed hard and early, the visit to the graveside, the pressure, the alliance with Pell, not primarily to frighten her into selling. He'd pushed to make her look for defenses, to make her go into the cellar and find the ledgers. And when she did find them and filed them, which any competent fighting person would do, he'd used it as the trigger for his counteroffensive. He'd wanted her to find the documentation, because finding it and filing it told him exactly what she had and gave him time to neutralize it before it could be used against him. "He's smart," Luke said quietly. "Yes?" Hannah said. She didn't say it like a compliment. "And now he knows the full shape of what I have. And he has lawyers and money and people willing to testify." "And you have 10 days, Wyatt said. "Yes." Another silence. Then Luke. "What does Arthur Crane say?" "I haven't told him yet." "Tell him tonight," Luke said, with an authority that belonged to someone twice his age. "Tonight, Miss Mercer, not tomorrow." Good. Arthur Crane's reaction when Hannah appeared at his door that evening and laid out everything was to sit down slowly in his chair and press his fingertips together and be very still for almost a full minute. She let him think. She'd learned that some people processed better in silence, and rushing them cost you the quality of what they eventually arrived at. "Gerald's counterclaim to the bank is actually quite elegant," Crane said finally. "If your father's payment records are challenged as fraudulent, the bank's position becomes legally ambiguous enough that they're justified in calling the loan. And if the loan is called and you can't pay, which you can't not in full, then Mercer Ranch enters foreclosure." He paused. "At which point Gerald and Pell are positioned to acquire it through the foreclosure process at reduced value. Clean. Legal. No direct transaction with you required." "So they never had to make me sell," Hannah said. "They just had to make the bank do it for them." "Correct." Crane looked at her. "The water rights documentation in my filing creates a problem for them, but not an immediate one. A fraud investigation moves slowly. A bank loan recall moves very fast." "Can you stop it?" "I can contest it." He picked up his glasses, put them down again. "The question is whether I can do it within 10 days with enough force to make Hale hesitate. Thomas Hale is a cautious man. He dislikes controversy more than he dislikes risk. If I can make the controversy of siding with Gerald worse than the controversy of waiting." He paused. "I need the witnesses. Wyatt is working on names. Good. And I need one more thing." He looked at her steadily. "I need someone willing to stand up in that bank meeting and corroborate your account records publicly. Someone whose word carries weight in this county. Someone Gerald cannot dismiss or discredit." Hannah thought about it. "Clem Dorsey," she said. "He's been in this county 40 years. He has no stake in Gerald's arrangements, and he does not like dishonest men." Crane almost smiled. "Clem is stubborn enough to say exactly what he knows in exactly the right place." "Yes. Can you get to him?" "Wyatt can." Crane nodded slowly. "Then we may have a path." He paused. "Hannah, I want to be honest with you about the odds. Gerald has significant legal resources, and he has moved faster than I anticipated. We're not favorites here." "I know. And yet, you're not afraid." She thought about that honestly. "I'm afraid," she said. "I've been afraid since the day my father went into the ground. But being afraid and being stopped are different things. My father taught me that." Crane looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising something he thought he already understood. "He did teach you that," he said quietly. "He taught you well." The next 6 days were the hardest of Hannah's life, and that was a meaningful statement given the competition. Wyatt worked the county quietly and methodically, following the threads of who had spoken to Gerald, who had been shown documentation, who had allowed their name to be attached to claims they may not have fully understood. He came back each evening with pieces of a picture that was ugly and clarifying in equal measure. 3 men had given statements to the bank. 2 of them she recognized the names were men who owed Gerald money on property arrangements of their own. The third was a clerk from the county assessor's office, who had been provided with what appeared to be supporting documentation by someone he described only as a legal representative. The clerk didn't know what he was signing, Wyatt told her on the 5th evening. He was shown papers that looked official and told they were a routine verification. He signed because he thought it was administrative, not adversarial. He can recant, Hannah said immediately. He can. He's willing to once I explained what the papers actually said. He's frightened, but he's not dishonest. He didn't intend this. And the other two, Wyatt's expression shifted. They're in Gerald's pocket. They won't move. But their statements are corroborated only by each other, which Crane says weakens them significantly in a formal review. So we have the clerk's recantation. And Clem Dorsey. Wyatt had spoken to Clem 2 days earlier. He used language when I explained the situation that I won't repeat in your presence, but the summary is that he'll be at that bank meeting and he'll say whatever is true and accurate, and Gerald Pruitt can go straight to... He stopped himself. I appreciate the summary, Hannah said. He also said that your father once helped him in a situation in 1876, and that a debt like that doesn't have an expiration date. Hannah pressed her lips together. She'd inherited more than a ranch. She'd inherited 12 years of her father's integrity, and it was paying dividends now in ways she hadn't known to account for. On the 6th day, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was in town coming out of Crane's office when she nearly walked directly into Martha Price. Martha, who had stood in the general store and told Hannah to consider Gerald's offer. Martha, who was the wife of one of the county's more respected businessmen, and who moved in circles that Hannah had never bothered to cultivate. Martha looked at her with an expression that was not the careful, pitying smile from the store. Hannah, she said, I heard about the bank letter. Most people have, apparently. Hannah kept walking. My husband spoke to Thomas Hale yesterday. Martha's voice made her stop. He told him that if the bank moved against Mercer Ranch on the basis of Gerald Pruitt's claims, we would be withdrawing our business from First Wyoming Trust and taking it to the bank in Laramie. Hannah turned around slowly. Martha's expression was direct and slightly uncomfortable. The look of a woman who knew she owed an apology but wasn't quite sure how to deliver it. The Prices have banked with Hale for 11 years, she said, and we are not the only family in this county who feel the same way about what Gerald has been doing. She paused. We should have said something sooner. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry we didn't. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, Martha, she said. It's the right thing, Martha said simply. It should have been said when you were standing at your father's grave. She walked on. Hannah stood on the Clearwater Main Street and felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with instability. The town was turning. Not all of it. Maybe not even most of it. But enough of it. Enough people who had been quietly uncomfortable with what Gerald and Pell were doing and had needed only a visible moment of resistance to align themselves with. She'd given them that moment, she realized. Not by being perfect or by winning every battle, just by refusing to leave, by still being there, still standing, still fighting week after week until the watching became participating. She went back to Crane's office and told him about the Prices. He listened and then said, How many others would follow their lead, do you think? I don't know, Hannah said. But I think we should find out before the bank meeting. The bank meeting was set for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. By Tuesday, Arthur Crane had done something that Hannah had not expected, and that later she would understand was one of the most strategically intelligent moves of the entire fight. He requested that the meeting be relocated. Not to a private room at the bank, to the Clearwater Courthouse meeting hall. His stated reason, submitted in formal writing to Thomas Hale, was that the matter involved county water rights documentation and potential fraud claims that were already on public record, and that any review bearing on those claims should, as a matter of legal transparency, occur in a public setting with proper record-keeping. Hale had the option to refuse. Crane had made sure, however, that the refusal itself would look like avoidance. In a county where people were already talking, a bank that refused to hold a public review of a public fraud dispute was a bank making a statement it probably didn't want to make. Hale agreed. When Gerald Pruitt heard about the relocation, Hannah found out through Wyatt, his reaction was volcanic. He'd prepared for a private bank meeting with controlled witnesses and a carefully managed proceeding. A public courthouse meeting was an entirely different situation. He tried to get Hale to reverse the decision, Wyatt told her Wednesday evening. Hale wouldn't. I think Hale has started calculating which side of this is safer for the bank, and he's no longer certain it's Gerald's side. Good, Hannah said. Pell has been quiet, Wyatt said. That worries me more than Gerald's noise. Pell calculates. When he's quiet, he's recalculating. She'd had enough exposure to the man's methodology to understand his pattern. He'll be at the meeting. He won't say anything. He'll be watching to see which way it goes before he commits to the next move. And if it goes our way, then Pell walks away. He's a speculator. He doesn't fight losing battles, he just redirects the investment. She paused. Gerald is the one we need to worry about. He has personal stake in this beyond money. Wyatt nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Hannah. He said her name in a way that made her look at him, not urgently. The opposite. With a deliberateness that suggested whatever came next had been considered for a while. After Thursday. Whatever happens Thursday, I want to talk to you about something. She waited. Not tonight, he said. After Thursday. When it's finished. She looked at him. The firelight in the room. The way he held himself steady, direct, never performing for anyone. All right, she said. She didn't ask what it was. She had a sense of it the way you have a sense of weather, and she found that she wasn't afraid of it. That surprised her, less than it once would have. Yeah, Thursday morning arrived the way important mornings do, ordinary in every physical detail, carrying extraordinary weight. Hannah dressed carefully, not for vanity, for respect for the proceeding for her father, for the ranch that had been in her family since before she was born. She rode into Clearwater beside Wyatt, with Crane meeting them at the courthouse door, and Luke, who had asked to come and been allowed because he'd earned the right 2 steps behind. The meeting hall was fuller than any of them had expected. Not just Thomas Hale and his bank representative, not just Crane and Gerald and Pell and their respective legal representatives. Half of Clearwater was there. The Prices. Martha's husband James, solid and deliberate, sitting where Gerald could see him. Clem Dorsey in the front row, with the expression of a man who had arrived specifically to be inconvenient to dishonest people. The county recorder, whose office had accepted Crane's filing present in an official capacity. 3 other ranching families Hannah recognized from years of county meetings. Gerald saw the room, and his face did something complicated. Pell stood against the far wall exactly as Hannah had predicted, watching, calculating. Thomas Hale opened the proceedings with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that the safest position was the most transparent one. He laid out the bank's concern about the irregularities in the documentation. He invited responses. Crane stood. He was 71 years old and slight, and his suit was 20 years out of fashion, and he spoke for 40 minutes with the precise, devastating clarity of a man who had been waiting his entire career for a case this clean. He presented the 1879 ledger. He presented the certified county recording. He walked Hale through the water rights irregularities line by line, figure by figure, year by year, 9 years of diverted county water access documented in Robert Mercer's unfalsifiable handwriting. Then he presented the clerk's recantation. Sworn, signed, witnessed. Then he called Clem Dorsey, who took approximately 4 minutes to establish in the direct manner of someone who had no patience for legal theater that he had worked on Mercer Ranch, that Hannah's records were meticulously accurate, that he had been paid exactly what she'd agreed to pay, and that in 40 years in Clearwater County, he had never known Robert Mercer or Hannah Mercer to falsify a single figure. Then James Price stood, not called volunteering, and said that the Price family had conducted business with Mercer Ranch on 3 occasions over the past 8 years, and had found every transaction documented and settled with precision. Gerald's legal representative tried twice to redirect. Crane dismantled both attempts with the patience of a man who had read every relevant statute before breakfast. At some point during the 3rd redirect attempt, Hannah noticed that Pell had moved to the door. She watched him leave quietly without a word to Gerald, without any acknowledgement of what was happening in the room. There was the calculation she'd predicted. The investment had been redirected. Gerald was alone. He stood when Pell left, a reflexive movement like someone who'd just felt the floor change under them. His legal representative put a hand on his arm. Gerald sat back down. His face had gone through several different versions of itself in the past 20 minutes, and had settled on something that was not quite defeat, and not quite rage, but somewhere between them the expression of a man who had played a long game, and watched it collapse in a public room in front of people who would remember. Thomas Hale called a brief recess. He came back 11 minutes later. "The bank finds insufficient basis to maintain the irregularity claim," he said in the level tone of an institution announcing that a position has been revised. "The Mercer Ranch loan account will be returned to standard standing. The bank thanks all parties for their participation in this review." The room moved. Hannah sat very still in it. Crane leaned over and said quietly, "It's done." She nodded. She couldn't speak yet. From across the room, Gerald looked at her. The complicated expression was gone. What was left was simpler and colder, the look of a man who had lost and knew it and wasn't finished. She held his gaze until he looked away. He would try again. Not today. Not in the same way. But men like Gerald didn't abandon what they wanted, they just found different routes. She understood that. She also understood that every route he tried from now on would have to pass through her, and she was still here, and she had no intention of moving. She felt Wyatt's hand brief warm certain settle on her arm for just a moment before withdrawing. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Luke on her other side exhaled a long breath that he'd apparently been holding for the better part of an hour. "Well," he said quietly, "that's settled." "It is," Hannah said. She stood. Outside the courthouse, the November air hit her face with the cold specificity of Wyoming in late fall, and Mercer Ranch was still hers, and the hill where her father was buried was visible in the distance if she looked east, and she looked east. "Dad?" she said under her breath, where no one could hear. Nothing answered. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down the road. The sky was the particular clear blue that came after hard weather. It was enough. She turned back to where Wyatt and Luke and Crane were standing, and she walked toward them, and for the first time since June, she felt the full weight of the future sitting ahead of her rather than on top of her. Wyatt caught her eye. "After Thursday," he'd said. Thursday was done. He said it that same evening. Not with preamble. Not with ceremony. They were standing on the porch of Mercer Ranch in the cold November dark. Luke inside doing dishes with the particular loud efficiency of a teenager who understood that the adults outside needed privacy and was giving it to them in the only way available. And Wyatt said what he'd been holding since before Thursday, as simply as he said everything. "I'm not leaving Hannah." She looked at him. "I don't mean the ranch work," he said. "I don't mean the fence repairs or the cattle or the well. I mean I'm not leaving. Not unless you tell me to." The night was very still. Somewhere in the barn, Duchess shifted in her stall, the leg almost fully healed now the mare's movements back to their normal settled authority. "You have your own ranch," Hannah said. "I do. It borders yours on the North Ridge." He paused. "That's actually quite convenient." She looked at him for a long moment. "Wyatt." "I know what I'm saying," he said. "I've known it for a while. I wasn't going to say it while you were fighting for the ranch because I didn't want you to think that any of what I did was—" He stopped. "I didn't help you to earn something, Hannah. I helped you because it was the right thing and because I wanted to. Those are the only reasons." "I know that," she said. "Then I'm telling you that I want to stay. Because this ranch feels like home in a way that nothing has since Eleanor died. And because you're the most capable, most stubborn, most genuinely decent person I've met in 11 years in Wyoming." He paused. "And because Luke talks about this place like it already belongs to him, and I've stopped trying to correct him." Something moved through Hannah's chest, warm, complete, with no anxiety in it at all. "He does belong here a little," she said. "He does." She looked out at the dark pasture and the stars and the hill where the cottonwoods stood over her father's grave, and she thought about the woman who had stood there in June with a shovel still dirty in her hands and made a promise that had felt in that moment like the only thing she had left. She'd kept it. More than kept it. "I'm not good at needing people," she said. "I know, I'm not either." He said it without judgment. "I've been told we're well matched that way." "Who told you that?" "Luke." She almost laughed. "He's 16. He's the most perceptive person in Clearwater County," Wyatt said. "You told him so yourself." She had. She remembered it. The morning in the barn with Duchess Luke's careful dark eyes catching everything. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm not proposing anything tonight," he said. "Tonight, I'm telling you where I stand, what I want, what I hope." He held her gaze with the directness that had been the same in every conversation since the night he showed up at her door with his hat in his hands. "I'm asking if you want the same things. And I'm telling you there's no wrong answer. If you need more time, I have time. If you need space, I'll give you space. But I won't pretend I don't feel what I feel because you've been honest with me since the beginning, and you deserve the same." Hannah looked at him. In June, she had buried her father and made a promise to a piece of land. She had fought for that land through summer and fall and the worst storm in a decade and a bank meeting that could have ended everything. She had done all of it, and none of it had been as frightening as standing on this porch right now with a good man waiting for her honest answer. "I don't need more time," she said. "And I don't need space." He was still. "I've known since the night in the cabin," she said. "When you kept the fire and let me sleep. I knew then." She paused. "I wasn't ready to say it. And now? And now the ranch is safe and Thursday is done, and I'm tired of keeping things at arm's length that deserve to be closer." She looked at him. "So yes, Wyatt, I want the same things." He exhaled a slow, full breath, the kind that releases something that has been held for a long time. From inside the house came the sound of a pot being set down, with slightly more force than necessary, and then absolute silence. The specific silence of a teenager who has stopped pretending not to listen. "Luke," Wyatt said at normal volume. A pause. "Yeah." She said yes. Another pause. Then with genuine satisfaction. "I know. I could hear you from the kitchen." Hannah pressed her hand over her mouth. "The dishes," Wyatt said. "Done," Luke said. "I did them fast." Hannah laughed fully properly, the first real laugh she'd produced in as long as she could remember, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Winter settled over Mercer Ranch with its full weight the way Wyoming winters did, not as a visitor, but as an occupant, something that moved in and expected accommodation. Hannah gave it none. She'd learned enough from her father and from her own first season managing the ranch alone to know that winter demanded respect, but not surrender. The cattle came through the worst months better than she'd dared hope. The well held. The barn held. Duchess's leg healed completely by late December, and on the first morning Hannah watched the mare move across the frost-stiff paddock with her normal fluid authority. She felt the particular satisfaction of a crisis navigated fully to the other side. Wyatt rode over most mornings. It was a practical arrangement. The work was simply more efficient with 2 people, and 2 ranches, managed in thoughtful coordination, were stronger than 2 ranches managed in isolation. That was what they told the county, and it was entirely true. It was also both of them understood without needing to say it something more than practical. Something that had found its shape through storms and ledger books and long evenings at kitchen tables, and had turned out to be quietly and without drama exactly what both of them had been missing for years. Luke spent so much time at Mercer Ranch that his horse began showing up in the paddock without anyone having to lead it there. He'd developed a system for the cattle feeding that was more efficient than Hannah's, and she told him so directly, and he received the compliment with the surprised pleasure of someone who hadn't expected to be taken seriously and then recalibrated when he was. Gerald Pruitt had left Clearwater County in early December. Not formally run out, nobody had to do that. The public record of the courthouse meeting had been enough. The water rights investigation that Crane had set in motion through the county recorder moved slowly as these things did, but it moved. And when a man's fraud is on public record in the county where he lives, the county has a way of making his presence unwelcome without ever saying so directly. He'd gone to relatives in Colorado, someone said. Nobody said it like it was a loss, Pell had, as predicted, redirected entirely. He was operating in another county now, someone else's problem. Hannah did not spend time thinking about him. The account books, when she spread them on the table in late January, told a story she hadn't dared read as recently as October. The cattle numbers were still rebuilding, but the trajectory was right. Duchess's breeding had produced 2 sound foals the previous spring, and with the mare fully recovered, the program was back on track for the coming year. The well was stable, the loan was current. The debt load, while not gone, was manageable on the current income, if the spring cattle sale went as projected. It wasn't wealthy, it wasn't easy, but it was solvent. Genuinely, verifiably solvent for the first time since before her father got sick. She sat at the kitchen table with the account books and a candle and let herself feel it all the way through, not held at arm's length, not qualified. Just, they had made it. She wrote the figure in the margin of the current ledger and underlined it twice. Then she wrote beside it in her father's style of recording what mattered, January 1889. Mercer Ranch, solvent. She looked at it for a while, then she closed the ledger and went to bed. It was Luke who brought up the wedding. Not Wyatt, not Hannah. Luke, who had apparently decided that the adults in his life were moving at an insufficient pace, and that someone needed to apply direct force. He did it at breakfast on a morning in February with the complete absence of embarrassment that only very young or very old people manage. "Are you two getting married?" he said, looking between them. "Because if you are, you should do it before spring roundup, because after that everything is too busy." Hannah looked at her coffee cup. Wyatt looked at his son with an expression of profound and resigned recognition. "We've discussed it," he said. "Discussed it or decided it, Luke. I'm asking because I'd like to know," the boy said with perfect reasonableness. "We're going to be a family, or we're not. I think we are. I'd just like it to be official so I can stop being uncertain about it." The kitchen was quiet. Hannah set down her coffee cup. "We're going to be a family," she said. Luke looked at her, steadily, the way he looked at things that mattered. "Okay," he said. "Good." He went back to his breakfast with the decisive satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something necessary. "Before roundup, though, I mean it about the schedule." Wyatt looked at Hannah across the table. She looked back at him. "He's right about the schedule," she said. "He usually is," Wyatt said. "It's genuinely annoying." "I heard that," Luke said. "You were supposed to," both of them said at the same time. The look on Luke's face when they said it together, the sudden startled delight of a boy watching two people become something, was something Hannah would keep for the rest of her life. The question of Gerald came back once more before it was fully settled. In March, Arthur Crane called Hannah to his office and told her that the county fraud investigation had concluded its preliminary findings. The water rights irregularities documented in Robert Mercer's 1879 ledger had been verified. Gerald Pruitt was facing formal charges that would follow him to Colorado and beyond. The county was in the process of reclaiming the redirected water rights and restoring the proper access agreements. "It's done," Crane told her. "Legally completely done. Your father's documentation was the linchpin. Without those ledgers, none of this moves forward." Hannah sat in the familiar, overheated office with its stacks of paper and thought about her father at that kitchen table in 1879, writing down numbers, because numbers didn't lie if you recorded them honestly. Writing them not knowing that his daughter would find them a decade later in a cellar by lantern light, with a man she hadn't met yet reading over her shoulder. He knew, she said quietly. Knew what? That someday it would matter. That someone would need those numbers. She paused. He kept records the way other men kept faith, like it was its own kind of moral practice. Crane looked at her over his glasses for a long moment. "He did," he said. And it was. She walked out of Crane's office into the March air and stood on the Clearwater Main Street and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since June. Not grief, exactly. Grief didn't settle, it just changed shape. Something else. The knowledge that her father's work had mattered past his death. That he had protected his daughter with the same tool he'd used to build the ranch, careful, honest documentation of the truth. She could live with that. More than live with it. She carried it home with her, like something valuable. They were married on a Saturday in late April, 2 weeks before spring roundup as scheduled. Hannah wore her mother's dress let out at the shoulders and taken in at the waist by Martha Price, who had shown up at the ranch in January with a sewing basket and an apology that was real this time and had been accepted in the same spirit. The dress was ivory, with small blue flowers worked into the collar, and it was the most beautiful thing Hannah had ever worn, and she didn't spend much time thinking about how she looked in it, because she was too busy thinking about everything else. The ceremony was outside in the clear Wyoming spring, with the long pasture stretching south, and the Cottonwood Hill visible to the east, and half of Clearwater standing in the new grass watching. Clem Dorsey was there, in a suit that looked like it had last been worn at a considerably earlier wedding and didn't fit him well in any dimension, but he wore it with the dignity of a man who understood that some occasions required the gesture regardless of the fit. Arthur Crane was there, standing very straight for a 71-year-old man, with an expression of deep satisfaction on his face that he wasn't making any effort to conceal. Martha Price cried before the ceremony started and didn't apologize for it. James Price stood beside his wife with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way of a man doing his best not to cry and not quite succeeding. The preacher said his words. Wyatt said his. He looked at her when he said them directly, steadily, with the same absolute absence of performance that had been the truest thing about him since the night he appeared at her door with his hat in his hands. He said that he had not expected to find what he'd found at Mercer Ranch, that he had come with a practical purpose and discovered something that made him question every assumption he'd built his life around, that he intended to spend the rest of his time on this earth being worthy of her trust, and that he understood that was a serious and ongoing project and he was ready for it. Hannah said hers. She had written them herself the way she kept the account books, directly without embellishment. She said that she had learned this past year the difference between strength and stubbornness, that she had confused them her whole life, and he had helped her see the distinction not by telling her, but by demonstrating it, by being strong enough to offer help, without making her feel diminished for needing it. She said that the ranch was still standing, and so was she, and that neither fact would be true in its current form without him. She said she loved him with the same plain certainty she used for everything that was true and important. Luke standing as Wyatt's attendant in a suit that fit him considerably better than Clem Dorsey's, because Hannah had measured him for it herself 3 weeks earlier, while he complained about standing still, had his jaw set in exactly his father's way throughout the entire ceremony. When it was done, and Wyatt kissed her, and the crowd made the noise that crowds make at weddings, Luke exhaled the same long breath he'd exhaled in the courthouse. Hannah reached out and touched his arm briefly. He looked at her. Before roundup, he said. Just like I said. Just like you said, she agreed. He smiled the open, unguarded smile she'd first seen in her barn in October, the one he hadn't yet learned to keep hidden. And then he composed himself with great dignity and went to accept congratulations from Clem Dorsey, who shook his hand like he was a grown man, which he more or less was. Spring roundup came and went. The cattle sale in May exceeded Hannah's projection by nearly $200. She recorded the figure in the ledger beside the January entry. Beside it she wrote May 1889. Mercer Ranch, profitable. She underlined it once. Her father had underlined things once when they were definitive. Duchess produced another foal in June, a bay filly with her mother's strong lines and her father's calm disposition. Luke named her without asking permission, and the name stuck immediately and permanently, which was Hannah had come to understand how most things happened when Luke decided they should. The summer was hard the way all frontier summers were hard. It was also, for the first time in Hannah's memory, genuinely good. The work was the same work, cattle fences, water, weather, land, but the weight of it was distributed now, across more shoulders, and the evenings were different. There were evenings now with voices in them, with an argument about the fence repair method that ended with all three of them laughing because Clem Dorsey arrived unexpectedly in the middle of it and sided with Luke. And Wyatt looked at Hannah with the expression of a man outnumbered in his own household. and she felt no sympathy whatsoever. There were evenings with the account books spread on the table and 3 heads bent over them. Wyatt's steady analysis, Luke's instinct for patterns, Hannah's meticulous recording building, something that was no longer just about survival. There were evenings with nothing at all required of anyone. Those were the ones she kept the most carefully. On a July evening, Hannah walked to the Cottonwood Hill. She did this sometimes not on a schedule, not as ritual, just when something needed to be said to the person she'd lost and hadn't stopped talking to. The hill was as it always was. The tree was larger in summer than it looked in any other season, full of leaves that moved in the evening wind with the same sound she remembered from childhood. The mound of earth had settled and greened over the way things did the way time insisted on. She stood there for a while without speaking, just being present in the way she'd learned from months of practice. Then she said what she'd come to say. "I kept my promise, Dad." The wind moved in the cottonwood. The ranch is still Mercer land. It will be. We're building something on it now that's bigger than I knew how to imagine when I was standing here in June. She paused. Gerald is gone. The water rights are restored. The loan is current. Duchess is breeding again. The books are... She stopped, let out a slow breath. "The books are good, Dad. Really good. You'd be satisfied with the numbers." She was quiet for a moment. Below the hill she could hear the ranch cattle settling for the evening. A horse in the paddock, the specific sound of Luke's voice carrying across the pasture, probably talking to an animal that had no particular interest in the conversation and no ability to leave it. She smiled. "You always told me that numbers were a kind of honesty," she said. "That if you wrote down what was true, eventually the true thing would protect you. You were right. Your numbers protected me after you were gone. The most important things you left me weren't in the barn or the pasture." She touched the cottonwood bark. "They were in that cellar, in your handwriting." The evening light was going gold the way Wyoming evenings did in summer, that specific warm quality that made everything look both more real and slightly impossible. "I learned something this year that I don't think I could have learned any other way," she said. "I thought strength meant carrying everything alone. I thought asking for help was the same as saying I wasn't enough." She paused. "You knew that wasn't true. You tried to teach me. I wasn't ready to hear it." A breath. "I hear it now." She stood there a little longer. Then she said the last thing quietly as a fact and not a plea. "I'm all right, Dad. We're all right." She turned and walked back down the hill toward the ranch. Halfway down, she could see Wyatt at the fence line doing the end-of-day check with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who treated every task as though it mattered because he believed it did. Could see Luke emerging from the barn with hay on his shirt and an expression of complete self-satisfaction that meant he'd solved some problem he hadn't mentioned yet. Could see her ranch, her family's ranch, her ranch, their ranch, stretching out in the gold summer light, solid and present and real. She walked toward them. Wyatt looked up and saw her and lifted one hand, not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement. "There you are. The simplest greeting. The best one." She raised her hand in return. Luke spotted her a moment later and said something to his father that made Wyatt shake his head with the resignation that was actually the deepest form of affection she'd ever witnessed. And she was still smiling about it when she reached the fence line and Wyatt fell into step beside her, without discussion, the way people do when they've learned each other's rhythms so thoroughly that proximity is simply where they belong. "Good walk," he said. "Good walk," she said. He nodded. Didn't press. Understood, as he'd understood from the beginning, that some things were hers alone, and that honoring that was part of loving her correctly. They walked the last of the fence line together in the gold evening, and the cattle were settled, and the well was full, and the ledgers in the house showed numbers that her father would have underlined, and Luke was talking to a horse that wasn't listening. And Mercer Ranch stood against the Wyoming sky, exactly as it had stood for 15 years, with the same bones, the same land, the same name on the deed. And something her father always knew, but she'd had to learn the hard way, at the cost of a hard year and a near-lost ranch and a storm she'd ridden into alone and almost not ridden out of. No one was ever meant to carry the frontier by themselves. Not the strongest woman in Clearwater County. Not the stubbornest rancher in Wyoming Territory. Not anyone who had ever looked at a piece of land they loved and decided it was worth everything they had. The frontier was built by people who showed up for each other. And Mercer Ranch Solvent standing alive with the sound of a family that had found itself sideways and in winter and in the best possible kind of surprise was proof of exactly that. It would still be standing tomorrow, and the day after, and long after the cottonwood on the hill grew too wide to put your arms around. That was the promise kept. That was the whole truth of it. And it was enough.